Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us this evening for a dialogue between Nya Lewis and Kosisochukwu Nnebe. My name is Jack Renee Bruno, and I'm the editor at C. Also, shout out to Mendak Mohammed, our reviews editor, who's behind the scenes tonight assisting with tech. Just to let you know, we're all recording this session. So before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that C Magazine's offices are located in Toronto, or Tikaronto, a Mohawk word meaning the place in the water where the trees are standing, which is said to refer to the wooden stakes that were used as fishing weirs in the narrows of local river systems by the Haudenosaunee and Huron-Wendat peoples. These lands are also the traditional and ancestral territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Anishinaabeg. Bearing in mind the complexities of acknowledging the land in the midst of an ongoing colonial project, we continue to do so at sea as an expression of gratitude for our hosts and in the effort to encourage our audiences to embody this acknowledgement in their daily lives in all of the ways that are possible to them. So this conversation and the artist project that it pertains to is the first of 3 to be supported in part by the RBC Emerging Artists Project. C Magazine's artist projects provide an opportunity for artists to explore, experiment, and grow within the specific parameters of the magazine's format. Spanning the first 6 and last 2 pages of the magazine, effectively bookending each issue, all the projects engage with the issue's respective themes and encourage each artist to harness the generative tensions inherent in the uniquely public and private nature of the magazine as an object. So all of the projects are original commissions and site-specific to the magazine format. Each one is curated by a guest curator, either solicited by C's editors or greenlit from submissions to the open call. That individual commissions a new work, writes the accompanying text, and hosts a public program with the artist, which is where we find ourselves tonight. And of course, the theme of this issue is grief, and Mendak will share a link in the chat to the project that it appears in the context of the table of contents for this issue if you're curious to learn more. So tonight's conversation, or tonight's program, will consist of a presentation from Kosi about her work, and then a conversation between our 2 guests, followed by an audience Q&A. And we encourage people to add questions to the chat at any point. The speakers have indicated that this is their preference, so don't be shy. And they're happy to answer things as they come up. So you can either do that by writing in the chat or by clicking the button to raise your hand. So I'm excited to have Nya and Kosi here with us this evening. In the context of the grief issue, this project felt exceptionally unique, considering not so much the suppressed, melancholic, ruminative condition that grief tends to impel, but the ways that grief ignites us. Its depth of feeling begetting something more active, offering an acute clarity on systemic effects that can boil beneath for so long that they're presumed to be organic. Nya put it astutely in their accompanying text, and I quote, "Caught in the cycle of irresolution, mourn, rage, survive, I inherited a persistent grief, inveterate and disenfranchised. It feels foreign and then again too familiar to name. It is, for me, trite, par for the course, and in no uncertain terms a contradiction, unwanted and vital, mine and borrowed," end quote. Kosi approaches the facet of grief that is rage in a singular swirl of historical research, home-style chemistry, and self-portraiture, and it's kind of shot through with a swirl of noir. So I'm really looking forward to hearing more about this work and the conversations that underpin it. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Nya, who will introduce themselves as well as Kosi.
Thank you, Jack. I have never heard anyone read my writing out loud. That was both terrifying and wonderful, so thank you. I'm Nya Lewis, and I'm an independent curator working here on the unceded traditional and ancestral lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, so-called Vancouver. And I say that my practice is hybrid, although I think I just like emerging in that I'm defining and redefining what it means for me to be a curator. And in this iteration of wherever my curation is, I'm working across programming and writing, design and advocacy, and community organizing. and I currently serve as the guest curator at Grunt Gallery here in Vancouver, and the artistic director for the Vancouver Queer Film Festival. I'm interested in absences and the uncovering of undesirable or underrepresented histories. Much of my work is lens-based archives and taking on interventions and incohesive juxtapositions to think through speculating new meaning, bringing new meaning to images, thinking through the construction of Black identities. I'm moved by the possibilities of Afro-surrealism, and ultimately, I think aim to just make visible the contributions of Black diasporic and Afro-diasporic culture production in Canada, and to reflect or critique the ways that conditions Black socio-political, spiritual, embodied, all of those things, how they inform artistic and curatorial practice and expression. So you can imagine that it was a dream to work with Kosi, who I've known for a long time. And finally had the opportunity to witness her brilliance up close in 2020 for the Vancouver Art Gallery. And I'm inspired by her work, and I'm learning a lot from her concerning Black epistemology and making and unmaking and ways to address social space, the way that it absorbs and hosts and refracts non-linguistic and historical forces. If nothing else, she is meticulous and thoughtful and creates with so much care and intention. She's also just an all-around awesome sister friend, brunch partner, fashionista, workout person, just fly. And I'm super honored to be here with you, and I'm gonna invite you to introduce yourself and to share your presentation with us.
Thank you so much. That was the sweetest introduction. So hi, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here with you today. I'm just going to share my screen, so give me 1 second. And I think that should be good. So I'm going to go ahead and just start off with a short presentation where I'm going to talk a little bit about my practice more broadly and kind of set the context for this project. And then from there, Nya and I will kind of continue a little bit more and expand upon the themes of the issue and the themes of the work. I'm super excited to be in conversation with you, Nya. Like the work that, the text that you wrote for this was just absolutely beautiful. So it's an honor to share this space with you and to talk through these ideas with you. And again, so much gratitude to Jack and Mendek and the rest of the C Magazine team for the opportunity to be part of the artist project for this issue. So with that being said, I'll just start. And I wanted to start with this series of photographs from 2017, actually. And the quotes underneath are going to be very hard to read, so I'm going to go ahead and read that out. What it says is, "I was not speaking of a marginality one wishes to lose, to give up or surrender as part of moving into the center, but rather as a site one stays in, clings to even, because it nourishes one's capacity to resist. It offers to one the possibility of radical perspectives from which to see and create, to imagine alternatives, new worlds." And this is a quote from Bell Hooks' 1989 essay, "Choosing the Margin as a Space of Radical Openness." And this essay and this quote really summarize many of the concepts first introduced to me by Hooks that have gone on to be major themes in my work, namely positionality, radical Black subjectivity, and Black epistemologies that come from a place of marginality and resistance. So this is another work from 2017, and it's a work that really aims to visualize some of the theory that Bell Hooks expounds in her work, especially one of seeing as revolutionary, as transformative, the marginal spaces in which Black women often find themselves relegated in society. And Bell Hooks' work is revolutionary in that it doesn't necessarily push for a movement to the center, a kind of adoption of colonizing mentalities, and instead asks that we really value and valorize the knowledge production, the perspectives, and the affect that is produced in these spaces of marginality, these spaces that become spaces of resistance and spaces wherein we can start to envision, build, and create a more just world. So it really is a kind of valorization again of these spaces of oppression in a way. And though these works are relatively old now, this is another one from 2017, what I was trying to do throughout them was to find a way to kind of exercise and find my own subjectivity. And by this, what I mean is an acknowledgement of the subject within a discourse, by the self and by the others. And this is an opposition to the kind of objectification or thingification that someone like Frantz Fanon speaks to as he describes and explains the process of racialization in his book, Black Skin, White Masks. And what Bell Hooks really pushes for is that as we attempt and find ways to find our own subjectivity, to assert that subjectivity, that we not merely fall into a discourse of good versus bad representation, that often fixes Blackness in relation to whiteness, but that we instead push for more transgressive representations of Blackness that aren't necessarily focused on opposition, but are instead focused on building something altogether new, really focused on remaking the sense of self that we can actually aspire to. So something that's much more transgressive, and that would lead us to representations of Blackness that are a little bit more slippery, that force us to rethink how we come to be racialized as Black, how we can live as Black people as well. And that is something that's always really inspired me. And the next work I'd like to turn to really quickly is an installation, a two-part installation from 2019 entitled, I Want You to Know That I'm Hiding Something From You, Since What I Might Be is Uncontainable. And this piece was again really rooted in not only Bell Hooks' work, I'll talk a little bit about how that comes through, but primarily in the work of Frantz Fanon and the ways in which he really studies the process of racialization. And the work is really focused on the spectrum of visibility and these politics of Black visibility that go from invisibility on one hand, and the room on the right with the podium is one that is focused on invisibility. And on the other end, what you have is a hypervisibility, and that's the room on the left with the body parts. And what Frantz Fanon shows in particularly in Black Skin, White Masks, is the way in which, regardless of whether or not it is hypervisibility or invisibility, this politics of visibility is one in which the Black body is threatened. It is always under the threat of violence, regardless of whether or not it's seen as hypervisible or invisible. There's policing of the Black body as a result of race being projected onto it. And this shapes and affects the ways in which we can navigate society. It shapes and affects the ways in which we can make sense of ourselves, the ways in which we can build and own our own subjectivity. And it shapes and affects the ways in which we can engage in intersubjective possibilities and build relations with other people and also with nature and so on. And what I wanted to do was focus a little bit more on the room that's on the right, because this room is engaged with the politics of invisibility, but also with a kind of focus on hesitation as a generative form of affect. And with this room, the podium that's at the center that becomes the centerpiece for the installation is actually fashioned after a slave auction block. And it's the only position within the entire room from which the installation can be fully experienced. So what I wanted to do in this particular space was to really value and kind of bring to light the kinds of perspectives, the vantage point that would have been afforded those people who would have been forced onto those slave auction blocks. So in a way to kind of question the knowledge production that was made possible by being in such a position of marginality, of oppression, and to really consider it as something that is valuable and something that we should think through. And there's an element of hesitation here in that the viewer is not expected or is not expected to know exactly how to interact with this piece and would hesitate as to how to engage with it before finally getting onto the auction block, which is in a way giving up a certain amount of power, because that is what it means to be put onto such a block. It is to become the object that is the object of other people's desires, fears, and so on. And by doing that, to be able to engage with that particular viewpoint and perspective. And this is an example of how this work would have been engaged with. There were instances of entire families going on the auction block, which was quite interesting to experience and witness. And it is going back again to the work that Bell Hooks, how Bell Hooks really thinks of marginality as a space of resistance, as something wherein we can access particular perspectives and particular knowledge. And it's asking us to really think through what that means, what it would have meant to stand on those, stand in certain positions. And it's about the epistemologies that are really produced from those spaces. Another work that I wanted to touch on really quickly actually moves us in a totally different direction. So this is a piece from 2020 entitled "And the World Waited to Caress Her." And this was produced as part of a group exhibition that was really exploring the sun, pleasure, and Black and brown bodies. And what you have essentially is a list of things that bring me joy that I printed on vinyl and then installed on the window ceilings in the hall of the gallery, such that when the sun was up in the sky, it would be activated by the sun and it would cast these shadows that weren't actually legible to those in the gallery, and really cemented the audience of this work as being the sun and nature itself. And this work is kind of a counterpoint to a lot of my older work or other work, which is really focused on Black visibility, focused on the process of racialization and the kind of violence it engenders, and in a way, Black pain. This work, on the other hand, is instead focused on Black pleasure and Black joy. And it was important for me, and actually quite challenging for me, to think about Blackness in that regard. But at the same time, as much as it became this important counterpoint, as much as it was important to center Black joy, I found then, and I find now, that those kinds of discussions don't get us away from the reality of Black life and the reality of Black pain and the reality of the world in which we live in, which is unbearably anti-Black, which forces Black people into situations that are absolutely untenable. And we are constantly reminded of the extendability of Black life. We were reminded of it in Buffalo. We are reminded of it on an everyday basis in small and large acts. And this is where I turn to theory to help make sense of this. I turn to Fanon, I turn to Hooks, and I turn to Christina Sharp. And Christina Sharp speaks of this Black unlivability, and her discussion of the unlivability of Blackness and her discussion of living in the wake of transatlantic slavery builds upon the work of Fanon and the ways in which he talks about Black people living in these zones of non-being as a result of being racialized as Black, and the kinds of threats, the threat of violence that we must live through on a constant basis. And Sharp continues this conversation and kind of describes Black unlivability as the ways in which Blackness signifies to live in the no's, to live in the no space that rejects Blackness, affirms and centers whiteness, and the ways that Blackness continues to resist by inhabiting, occupying, and dwelling in these impossible and difficult realities within anti-Black societies. In a way, what this meant for me and why this is important is that it asks that we sit with the realities of Black life. It asks that we sit with the reality of Black suffering, and that we understand that experiences of Black joy, experiences of Black pleasure are always within the context of living in the wake of transatlantic slavery, and the context of this tragedy that has very much fundamentally shaped the world as we know it and as we experience it. And these are things that we cannot escape. And it has led us to live in this unlivability. And what this affords us when we can sit with this reality is it affords us an alternative way of knowing a praxis of care and a particular methodology for attending to Black life and Black suffering that really avails us to particular ways of reimagining the world that are in responses to the varied and various ways that Black lives are lived and unlivable. So to sit with this pain, to sit with this suffering, to sit with this unlivability is to find ways to live with it, but also to find ways to resist it. And one of the ways that we hold on to and express our subjectivity is through our capacity to express our emotions through an effective register whose manifestations are both somatic and psychic, individually and collectively experienced, material and intangible in nature, feelings of deep joy and pain, of affection and fear. And the issue is that living in an anti-Black world that is structured around the dehumanization of Blackness, Black feeling and Black affect in particular, which is described as the social feeling or bodily intensity, is itself a threat that needs to be made unintelligible. And for me, this is why the tears of Black women are never given the same currency as the tears of a white woman. It is why proclaiming Black joy is seen as a radical act. It's because Black affect is under constant surveillance and consumption. And this relates not only to Black pain and Black suffering, but also to Black joy. There's this constant need to consume, to control Blackness and the way in which we express our emotionality as well. And I find that the form of affect that is most heavily policed is rage. And this is because Black rage is the most threatening to white supremacy. Black rage, rage being this uncontrollable anger, is something that speaks to the potentiality of revenge. And revenge in the way that Frantz Fanon describes it and speaks to it in Wretched of the Earth, which is a remaking of the world order using violence. And this is a huge threat, and this is something to be afraid of coming from a space of white supremacy. And so Black rage is the thing that needs to be dismissed. It's the thing that needs to be made unintelligible. And this is why any instances of protests are automatically seen and labeled as riots and policed accordingly. This is why you have, in my opinion, again, all of this is just like me kind of thinking through these things. This is why you have the stereotype of, it's a way of dismissing Black rage, of making it into something that is small, because there's an understanding that Black rage is corrosive. There's an understanding that Black rage will eat away at anything in its path. And so those who harbor Black rage, knowing that to express it is to risk death, learn to hold on to it, and it eats away at us. And it becomes something that we carry with us everywhere, and we choke on it because there's no way to let it out. And all of these feelings were beautifully captured in this essay by Bell Hooks that actually Nya was the one that recommended that I read it. And the essay starts with, I am writing this essay sitting beside an anonymous white male that I long to murder. And in this essay, Bell Hooks describes an experience of being on a plane with a friend who is forced out of first class because the air stewardess accuses her of occupying a seat that is not her own. And Bell Hooks reflects on the white man who takes the seat instead and the feelings of rage she harbors towards him. And what's important to note is that it is when her rage has no outlet that it transforms into grief. And this is a quote from the essay. I felt a killing rage. I wanted to stab him softly, to shoot him with a gun I wish I had in my purse. With no outlet, my rage turned to overwhelming grief, and I began to weep, covering my face with my hands. And elsewhere in the essay, she speaks to how we are choking down that rage. And Hooks is so incredible in describing rage and the difficulties around rage and the ways in which historically to express that rage was to risk a lynching. To express that rage was to risk literal violence. And so she speaks to this luxury of forgetfulness. She speaks to the way in which Black on Black crime is a way of getting rid of that rage that we cannot afford to actually direct at whiteness. And she speaks to the way in which rage is consumed. But she also speaks to the way in which rage helps us direct our, helps us direct and actually, sorry, I'm going to find the quote. Confronting my rage, witnessing the way in which it moved me to grow and change, I understood intimately that it had the potential not only to destroy, but also to construct. So rather than something that is useless, without meaning and destructive, Cooks acknowledges and helps us see how rage can be harnessed for transformative revolutionary action, for fighting for a more just world, for resisting the structures that dehumanize us and force us to live in unlivability. So there is an immense, immense power and range in terms of rejecting the systems that we are forced into that are absolutely untenable, and that create this reality of an unlivability. So this gets me to Cassava and to this particular project. And this project actually, this artist project is actually an outgrowth of a broader exhibition that I'm working on right now as part of Brown Butter, which is an exhibition at the Agnes Etherington in Kingston that opens in June. And that exhibition is about Blackness and food. And when I put together my proposal for it, I wasn't so much thinking about food and more so thinking about consumption of Blackness, as I've kind of talked about throughout this presentation, and finding ways of speaking to Blackness that aren't easily consumed. And this is where I arrived at rage as that thing that is not easy to consume. Even though there are efforts to minimize it, it remains something that is deeply transformative and has the potential to burn down, but also to create new systems altogether. And I tried to find a way to speak to rage in a way that connected it to food. And my sister had done her master's on cassava, and I knew based on her master's research that cassava is a naturally poisonous crop. So cassava is a tuber that is indigenous to South America, and there are two kinds of cassava. So the kind that you would find in a supermarket in North America is sweet cassava, and then there's bitter cassava, which is more commonly found in West Africa and has a higher cyanide content. So the ability and the knowledge with which to process cassava so as to make it edible actually comes from indigenous peoples of South America, namely the Arawak and the Tainos. And they passed that knowledge along to the Portuguese, who then brought cassava from South America to West Africa, which is something that isn't super well known, and shared that knowledge again with enslaved Africans as well as Africans on the continent. So what you have is, given this kind of tendency or desire to want to catalog and categorize, what you have are a lot of documents from the 18th and 19th centuries from Englishmen and other kind of Europeans that try and categorize the flora and fauna of these colonies, including places such as Jamaica. And they speak to cassava and they speak to it from a kind of botanical perspective, but they also speak to the ways in which it is used by enslaved Africans and by indigenous peoples. So you'll have these kind of paragraphs describing cassava and how it's used. And what I found were instances where they would talk about how they called it the thumbnail method. And it's a method by which enslaved Africans and indigenous peoples actually took the cassava and instead of trying to get rid of the cyanide content, would try and concentrate it in order to create a poison with which to poison Europeans and particularly slave masters. And even when you read these documents, these paragraphs, you'll go from something that is quote unquote objective descriptions to this kind of warning. Like, by the way, this is a thing that you should be cautious of. And this kind of fear that you can still feel, even like centuries later, you can hear and feel that fear, I found was fascinating, because here you have these documents that are trying to conflate enslaved Africans and indigenous peoples with flora and fauna as things to be objectified, as things to be put on the same level and to be studied. And yet, through this fear, there's a way in which you can tell that these enslaved peoples and these indigenous peoples have managed to assert their subjectivity, have managed to insert themselves as subjects within a discourse that would want to merely see them as objects, have managed to exercise their sovereignty and self-determination, and fundamentally to reject a system that was premised on their dehumanization. And for me, I saw it as such an incredibly powerful act of rejecting the unlivability that they found themselves within, of taking power back into their own hands, and fundamentally of taking what I know must have been deep, deep rage and harnessing it into something else, something deeply transformative and radical and revolutionary. And this is what I wanted to harness. I wanted to take the rage that I feel on a daily basis, and I wanted to transform it into something else. And I wanted to see those histories of resistance, those histories of revolution as my inheritance. And so this work, in a way, functions as almost like an heirloom, right? So you could think of it as a recipe being passed on from generation to generation. And instead of it leading to me cooking a nice, like, home cooked meal or soul food, it's giving me the knowledge and the ability to create a poison with which to take control of my life again. A reminder that I can and I do have the power to reshape my life in the ways that I need to, and I have the power to reject these situations of anti-Black violence that surround me at every level. And these are the steps for making the cassava, the poison. So I'll go through them really quickly. So first and foremost, you cut and peel the cassava, you grate it, and you wring the liquid. So the liquid is where you'll have the cyanide actually leaching into that liquid, and you preserve it, and you let that putrefy. And over the time, as it's putrefying, you'll have like flies come and lay eggs in the liquid, and then you'll have maggots that grow. You take those maggots that have essentially concentrated the cyanide content, and then you let them dry. I'll go to the next one, sorry. You harvest the maggots, you let them dry, you crush them, and you turn them into a powder. And then it's called the thumbnail method because enslaved Africans would grow out their thumbnails, take that powder and put it under their thumbnails as a way of covertly transferring it into the food and drink of the person they intended to poison. So the thumbnail method was something that inspired fear in the hearts of slave masters. So they would actually pay attention to the length of the thumbnail of enslaved Africans as a way of knowing if there was an intention to poison. And I was just so fascinated by this ability to incite fear. And I was so inspired and kind of fascinated by just this history. And I think it's important to note that this series of photographs, and a huge shout out to Vladimir Vinay, who is the videographer I worked with on this project. So these are stills from a video. This series of photographs doesn't end with me slipping the poison into the food and drink of an unsuspecting kind of target, but rather it ends with a loaded weapon. Fundamentally, this work is meant to act as a reminder. It is meant to act as a threat. It is meant to communicate that there are other options available if we are able to harness that rage in a way that doesn't necessarily only transform it into grief. And grief is important, but grief is one of the only emotions that we are allowed to express, and that is because rage can lead us to solutions and to acts that are deeply transformative. And it's not necessarily encouraging violence in this way, but more so encouraging us to think of the ways in which we can rethink the system altogether, that we can dream beyond it, that we can dream of destroying it, that we can dream of creating something that is fundamentally rooted in our humanity, rather than one that is rooted in a disbelief of our basic rights. So this is the work. I think I'm going to go ahead and end there. I don't know how long that was, but I'm really excited to be in further conversation with Nya and with everyone who's on this call to talk a little bit more about it, the inspiration behind it, the aesthetics of it. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Okay, amazing. Thank you so much. That was so full. I almost feel like you have you have covered all the things that I wanted to ask you to go into more detail about, but it's okay. We're still gonna chat. I want to remind or poke, I should say, attendees that we are using the Q&A function. We are also using the chat. So please be in conversation with us. We would love that. How are you? You're okay?
Me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. In our intro meeting to this project, we spoke about being completely over the term resilience in general, and wanting to consider grief as like a register of emotions that allowed for agency, for vulnerability, for violence, for protection, for refusal, for all of the pieces. I want to also say that I'm extremely proud of our collaboration. As Jack said, it stands out. It stands out in the issue. I think it took a lot of bravery for us to be handed a topic like grief, and for us to choose to articulate in a way that made sense for us. But we both acknowledged that feeling that it was imperative for rage to be this very legible emotion in this act of refusal. And for me, I think it was the only access point to grief that I had. Writing about grief, I was like, but rage, that I can do. I felt immediately, I felt immediate relief in thinking through writing about rage. And I think my original pitch described the potential of rage and grief as edification. And I'm really thinking through how it circled back edification to your consumption of Blackness, to your thoughts around how we are trying to articulate what instructs or lifts me is much more than resilience. Mm-hmm. And I think I keep coming back to Lucille Clifton's writing and how she colored oppression and persistence and almost indifference, and the necessity of access to what feels like other worlds or spaces of transcension for everyday survival, that it is absolutely unfathomable, that is unlivable, that is but also completely mundane, and something that we've normalized to the point where it feels like the term grief is not for me. So I know you shared already how you come to this work, but I wondered if you might be willing to be vulnerable about how you come to grief, how this project has maybe changed or reshaped your own articulations of grief, and not to be in your business, but if you wanted to share about that.
How I come to grief. I mean, grief is one of my close friends, I feel, I think there's a lot of emotions that growing up, like in the way that I did in a predominantly white space with a lot of internalized racism, grief, shame, rage, they all go hand in hand in a lot of ways. And I think that we learn to hold on to them and make space for them in our lives in ways in which we almost forget that they're there with us, because they're constants. So I think, you know, when we think of even Black joy in the context of Black unlivability, Black joy is always for me kind of like in relationship to grief. And I think, like, I was thinking about this earlier today. I think it's one of the reasons I loved Arthur Jafa's work so much. The message, sorry, what's the name again? The Message is Love, or do you remember what it's called? I'm gonna pull it up actually. Love is the message and the message is death. So this is a video work I saw, I don't remember how many years ago, and it stays with me still, like every time I even think about it, because the way in which he presents it is Black joy, Black life, Black pain, and Black death are always together. They're always operating at the same time. And I think sometimes it's hard to carry such conflicting emotions always with you, and yet we have to, because that's the only way, at least I found, that I can live through like this existence, these constant reminders of the reality that the world as we know it was shaped based on this understanding that we were less than, right? Like that is literally like capitalism. Everything that surrounds us is premised on that. And we live in the aftermath of that, and we can never run away from that. And so any instance of Black joy, any instance of Black pleasure is always within that context. And it is not a way to kind of dismiss those other emotions. It is just simply to recognize structurally and systemically, like this is where we find ourselves, right? And that's just the reality. And it's disheartening and it's scary, you know, and everything is in that context, and it's heartbreaking, obviously. And that's grief. It's grief on an everyday basis.
Absolutely. I kind of want to ask how you hold space for that dichotomy. I think for me, my biggest fear was that I was oversimplifying the vehicle through which I process grief and rage, that it was just this opportunity to turn it into something of like constructive critical consciousness, or to reignite my commitment to justice. But I think that comes from my Caribbean background, where it feels like grief, my grandparents would carry grief as a necessity, like it's that thing that gave them the extra edge. You know what I mean? And they would, I mean, I don't know that they had the language for it in that way necessarily, but it was important, at least for me when writing, to be honest about how I come to my own understanding about grief, this like obligatory condition, this compounding nature. And I remember thinking, you know, one of the things I'm always citing my parents because my parents are awesome, but they would be like, your shows are so timely. And it's like, except that it's not timely, right? Like Black grief is just always and ceaseless. And I cited my nanny in the writing, my grandmother, and I remember it being very important for me to learn, and to learn quick, that it was useless to mourn, that it was useless to grieve. And so I had this concern that I was going to be announcing or saying that I was feeling like it was a dichotomy that couldn't be held in the same space, right? That if grief exists, it only exists to like transmit to this other thing that we're going to instrumentalize into something else, because I don't have the words to articulate how to sit in it, because that's not something that I have access to, or you know, that we are oversimplifying that process. But do you feel that challenge as well, or are you
That challenge of
holding space for both?
For both? No, I don't think I feel it anymore. I think I've kind of learned to accept it, to be honest. And I think, yeah, I've learned to accept it as just like the reality of what we're living through. And of course, it's disappointing. It feels like we're going backwards constantly, and it feels like we can't imagine a world outside of this. And that feels, like I said, scary on all kinds of levels. I think that to accept it as such is to not force it in a way. I think I'm wary because even here, you know, like talking about Black grief, like in a public space, I'm afraid of performing Black grief as well, right? I feel it on a constant basis. I don't need to talk about it. I think there's often an expectation of, and this is the thing that's so difficult when you talk about consumption of Blackness. How do you find ways of expressing your emotionality without it being consumed and made into something else, right? Because you talked about like sitting in something without feeling the need to instrumentalize it. I sit with things all the time. The people who instrumentalize it, it's not me per se. Like, you know, I feel like any instance of us trying to depict Black joy will then be like instrumentalized into something else. Black pain will be instrumentalized into something else. When I express Black grief, when I express Black pain, when I express anything, it's me expressing myself, right? Because that's a human function. That's a function of art. It is a form of expression. Mm-hmm. It is instrumentalized by others, right? So me creating this work is me sitting with my emotions. It's not necessarily meant to do something else, but there's a possibility someone else will take it and do something with it. And that's beyond me. There's a possibility someone will sit and listen to me talking about Black grief and it will make them feel good or bad or whatever. And that will feed into their own like emotionality and make them kind of like, I don't know, right? That isn't me. That goes beyond me. And that's the reality. Like everything is under consumption. Everything will be used. So how do you function within that? I don't even know.
I don't have that. That's what I was asking. But,
Right.
But no, absolutely. And I think there's a bravery that comes with learning how to sit with it. And I think it's, at least for me, an ongoing process. And thinking through who else might pick up this work or what lives within this work and the possible afterlife of this work, and thinking through Black subjectivity and this kind of interior space of meaning that I think we've been able to create here. One of the most challenging parts for me in writing this essay was actually the editing and working through the edits. I write very clearly for Black folks. And for me, what does it mean, as you said, to write about my grief to a predominantly white CMAG audience? To be able to use shorthand or language or phrases that it's indicative of my Caribbean upbringing and the types of relationships that are honest to the types of relationships that I have to grief. And how do I use citation as an invitation and also as a boundary? Mm-hmm. So that I can have some say and control over who this is for and how it's received, even though I know I'm putting it out into the universe in print form. So that's not always possible, but these were my thoughts, and given my challenges with it, just like how challenging it was for me to access those emotions. How do I write about grief in a way that's, again, like just honest to the complexities of our collective experiences, and writing it, as I think you had said to me, through this intertextuality. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering if you can speak to the other influences, to the other voices that are speaking in your work.
Oh yeah.
And how you, as an artist, have kind of engaged citation and created your own little footnotes, artist footnotes within your work.
Well, I mean, when you saw it, I think you got the Carrie Mae Weems vibes automatically, right? So that's the intertextuality for me. That's like the kind of citation and footnotes. Immediately, I knew that I wanted to kind of be in conversation with Carrie Mae Weems and the way in which she depicts Black women and the way in which she captures our interiority and our subjectivity so beautifully. I knew I wanted to be kind of in conversation with Lorna Simpson and her shift, right? So like I found that dress and I was so in love with the dress because it reminded me of a kind of like updated version of Lorna Simpson's shift. And the way I've cut like my face in a way to kind of preserve anonymity and kind of speak to a kind of broader Black woman experience was again going back to Lorna Simpson. The text again is going back to Carrie Mae Weems and the way in which in some of her older works she uses both Carrie Mae Weems and Lorna Simpson do that. So it was in a way a love letter to both of those women, the way in which the aesthetics of this are put together, the visuals of this are put together. And it's always that kind of like wanting to find that subjectivity, that radical Black subjectivity that Bell Hooks speaks of, that, you know, takes an image like this that is like honestly quite beautiful. Like these stills are stunning. And we talked about this. I was so afraid of these works being just seen as pretty. Right?
Yeah.
And I think I was trying to find a kind of like sweet spot between, yes, kind of hiding the intentionality of the work, right? So using these very beautiful images to kind of hide the fact that what you're trying to do is create a poison. And also using the text and kind of like, you know, we talked a lot about the font and trying to destabilize it and not make it as like aesthetically pleasing. So yeah, just even that balancing act, all of that was very much inspired by the works of other Black women artists who have so deeply inspired me. So like I said, Lorna Simpson, Carrie Mae Weems, Bell Hooks, of course, Fanon constantly coming back through my work. It was so interesting, like really engaging with Christina Sharp and her kind of discussions. In the Wake, I really do think is an absolutely stunning kind of approach of thinking through Black life. But at the same time, there's this juxtaposition of, you know, it's not necessarily only an Afro-pessimist kind of view of like this focus on Black death constantly. I think the way she does it is so beautiful because Black death and Black life are just in constant kind of like conjunction. And I think it reinserts a sense of agency and a sense of like finding ways to exist within these spaces that I think is fundamentally like beautiful and really transforms the way in which we see these things so that we're not constantly running away and thinking that we need to move beyond Black pain, but finding ways to sit within in order to find, you know, things that go beyond opposition, right? And that's what Bell Hooks encourages us to do, to think beyond opposition, to find otherwise ways of like understanding Blackness.
Absolutely. I think you were extremely successful in that. We were in that Illustrator fighting for our lives. We were. We really were. No, but you were extremely successful in that. And I remember I kept saying like they are absolutely aesthetically beautiful, but they're eerie.
That's what I wanted. Yeah.
They're eerie. And like, yeah, shout out to Vlad and like the lighting and the way that you were captured, you know, you, again, like the decision to not use your entire face, like you left something for wanting. And I think it spoke so clearly to the kind of like secret and powerful and rebellious nature of the history that you were depicting. And almost a kind of critical fabulation there as well. But I thought, yeah, it was really, I think you were really successful in that. We're coming down to the end. No comments, but also no pressure. I acknowledge that we were talking about Black grief, that we did not come to Kiki. So, you know, I acknowledge that it's also an extremely heavy week in light of the Buffalo murders and terrorist attacks for Black folks engaging with Black death right now. And so please engage us with care and care for yourselves. And I'm just gonna, I'll ask the last question and then we'll just leave it there and thank you for being here with us. you did introduce in this work the historical context of the use cassava, and I've also heard you extend this kind of like agency to mass suicide and like collective resistance, thinking through like the 1803 Igbo reclamation, jump off the ship, St. Simon's Island in Georgia, excuse me, and the way that oral traditions kind of create mythology and legacies. Yeah, really legacies in the fact that, you know, there's this lasting story that they flew away, that they walked over the water back to Africa. And I just wonder, excuse me, excuse me, sorry. I just have a small frog in my throat. In the potential, in the transformative potential to kind of shape those types of revolutionary actions, what do you see as the work of continuing? If you moved that radical action to the types of things that we're seeing now, obviously we're not poisoning people with cassava, but there's other movements and actions that we are arming ourselves with in other ways. And how do you see that work of continue, the work to continue?
I feel it's funny because I didn't actually think about that. How does this actually continue? I don't even know. I think, what does this actually look like now? I really don't know. And I think acknowledging and recognizing that I don't know is kind of like makes me even more in awe of those enslaved peoples who are like, no, this is what we're gonna do. And I think, you know, like I said, Bell Hooks talks about this luxury of forgetfulness that I think we're all in. And Ta-Nehisi Coates speaks about this kind of dream state that a lot of us find ourselves in, mainly white people. But I think that there's such I don't know, we can't think beyond these circumstances that we find ourselves in. We can't think of what it would mean to wholesale tear them down. Or maybe we can. We talk about defunding the police. We talk about a lot of things. Maybe that's it. You know, fundamentally, maybe that's what we're talking about, right? And I think that I mean, I'm going to acknowledge what I'm an artist, but like there's a lot of people who are doing this work and thinking through these things in much better ways than I am. But I think that would be one example. There's one question here.
Oh, awesome. They're wondering about your process and decision-making in terms of rendering your readings of theory into visual languages and images.
I don't know. How would I answer that? How is the relationship between the way words land with you and the images you create? That's a really great question. I don't actually know.
You do a lot of text-based work as well, and I think a lot of your work starts in these research phases, but at least I'm not to put words in your mouth, but the visual articulation of it almost seems like it comes after. Like you sit with the text, you sit with the text long.
I love theory. I love theory. I mean, right now it's a bit too much for me, so I haven't read in a while, but it was great going back to school and being able to like deep dive into that for a little bit. Yeah, I read a lot of theory and I sit with it, and honestly, it kind of just comes to me. And I think what's been really interesting since the pandemic is kind of like thinking through my art practice and creating as a very spiritual endeavor. So especially with these kind of works, I do feel like there is a kind of me being guided in how to create these works, and it just comes, and there's no other way for me to describe it. Like I remember like the podium for that 2019 installation literally just like came into my mind's eye, and I was just like that was the first thing that I saw, and everything else flowed from that. And yeah, I don't know how else to kind of describe that process. It's the research and then the hoping that something will come to you and then going from there.
It's God-given.
Yeah, thank you. Let's just say it's that.
Yeah, I think so. Thank you so much for your question, Brendan.
Thank you.
If we're good, I will kindly ask Jack to join us. Oh, is there?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Oh, Mandeek. Oh, when I read Nya's words and look at Kosi's image of poison harvesting, think of Black rage that demands the end of this world. Can you speak more about the work of rage? Then we can conclude. Okay.
Yeah, I think rage is world making. You know, I really do think it is. I think it's the ultimate rejection and refusal of the world as we know it and experience it now. And it's the kind of desire to push it to its boundaries in order to see what can happen after. And I think that's how, like, I mean, like poisonings, like when you think about that, and like, I really do think that there's a link between rage and poisoning. It's one of the kind of like inciting events that led up to the Haitian Revolution, right? There was a plot of mass poisoning that this is not a history that I know super well, but I remember being told to look into it, and I still have to, obviously. But this is a huge part of that history as well. And I think it is at the root of some of these revolutions. And I think what was another thing I wanted to talk about was the way in which poisoning was seen as a woman's weapon in particular, because in order to poison, you need access to like the home of the person you intend to poison, right? So when you're with it, you're taking on these domestic roles. It becomes easier to do that. So a lot of these cases of poisoning were done by enslaved women. So yeah, I think that at the end of the day, like it's a very revolutionary act. And I think that rage is really fundamentally about reimagining the world. And I think that's why I was so drawn to that particular form of affect, because it really gets you to thinking through and coming to the final conclusions of what it would mean to pull everything down, right? And that is through oftentimes violence. That is through, and again, like going back to Fanon and kind of like his chapter concerning violence, and that is like literally the remaking of the world, where the first becomes the last. It is through violence, it is through rage, it is the remaking of the world order. That is what rage does. Yeah.
And what does it mean to be able to harness that as marginalized people? I think is also important to consider that when we do kind of use it and bring it into our own, does it then become this, again, mechanism for something much greater, this our own form of destruction and to destroy, to our own form of destroy and rebuild.
I just think that there's so much with rage, and like, anyways, there's so much more that I could talk about and like explore, but yeah, that was the project. Thank you so much to everyone for tuning in. Thank you, Nya, for being like such an amazing collaborator.
Thank you. I appreciate you. I see Jack is on the, okay, awesome. I'm muting myself now.
Okay.
Okay. Oh, thank you both so much for your openness and your generosity and your eloquence, and for both your spirits as well. This was really fun, just as it was really deepening way of connecting with the project. So thank you both so much. If people are interested in getting a copy of the issue, which I highly recommend, the full project is actually not online, so you do need to get it in print in order to see the whole thing. We're offering a 33% discount on subscriptions for everyone who attended tonight's program. And then also, if you're interested in proposing an artist project, we recommend signing up for the newsletter so that you get the announcements for our next issue theme. And we also accept print and online review pitches all the time, which you can read more about on our submissions page, which I think Mandek will also link to. That brings us to the end. Have a beautiful evening. Looks like it's sunny outside here in Toronto, so maybe get and enjoy it. But thanks again, Kosi and Nya. This has been incredible, and looking forward to following both of your work moving forward as well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.